The air in the Grand Central Terminal was thick with the scent of ozone and hurried departures. A chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, garbled announcements, and the collective murmur of 1,000 intersecting lives. For Liam, however, the cavernous space held only a single, silent note of anticipation. It was a feeling so pure and potent it seemed to vibrate in his bones, a hum that drowned out the city's relentless noise. He checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes, the sleek metal cool against his wrist. 3:14 p.m. She was due any moment. He smoothed the front of his gray peacoat, a nervous habit he couldn't shake, and scanned the sea of faces pouring from the arrival gate. He was looking for a ghost, a woman he knew only through pixels and prose, a voice he'd constructed in his mind from the cadence of her typed words. Alara. Even her name felt like poetry. He clutched the book in his hand a little tighter, its spine worn, its pages softened by countless readings. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, it was their signal. "I'll be the one holding our roadmap," she had written, and he'd smiled, understanding immediately. Their entire relationship was a roadmap of words, charting the territories of their souls. He had memorized her face from the handful of photos she'd sent. Sun-drenched images of a woman with kind, intelligent eyes, a cascade of dark hair, and a smile that seemed to hold a gentle secret. He imagined that smile on her face now, searching for him in the crowd. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. What if she didn't like him? What if the chemistry that flared so brightly on screen fizzled into awkward silence in person? He pushed the thoughts away. This was different. What they had was real, built on a foundation of shared vulnerabilities and late-night confessions that transcended the physical. They had excavated each other's pasts, celebrated each other's small victories, and held each other, metaphorically, through moments of doubt. After 6 months of this intimate, disembodied dance, the physical meeting felt like a mere formality, the final, beautiful step in a journey already completed. A figure detached from the main flow of the crowd, moving with a hesitant, almost apologetic gait. Liam's eyes snapped to the object in their hands. A book, a familiar, worn-looking book with a faded green cover. Leaves of Grass, his breath caught in his throat. But it wasn't her. It was a young man, slight of build, with a pale, anxious face and large, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light. He couldn't be more than 25, dressed in clothes that seemed a size too big for his frame, as if he were trying to hide within them. Liam's first thought was one of crushing disappointment, quickly followed by confusion. Was this a messenger? A friend she had sent ahead as some kind of joke? The young man stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the matching book in Liam's hand. He looked terrified, like a cornered animal. His knuckles were white where he gripped the book. Liam forced a tight, questioning smile. "Are you looking for someone?" The young man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. He seemed to be struggling to form words, his mouth opening and closing silently. Finally, a voice emerged, quiet and trembling, but undeniably masculine. "The stars are brightest in the ink-black sea." It was the phrase from their very first conversation. The line of poetry she, Alara, had sent him, the one that had hooked him instantly. A private, sacred code between them. Hearing it from these lips, in this voice, was a profound and visceral violation. The world tilted on its axis. The noise of the station roared back into his ears, distorted and menacing. Liam stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes and ears were telling him. The sun-drenched photos, the soft, feminine prose, the entire 6-month tapestry of his emotional life. It all began to unravel, thread by horrifying thread. This person, this trembling boy, was not a messenger. He was the message. The smile vanished from Liam's face, replaced by a mask of cold, dawning horror. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of all its earlier warmth. The young man's eyes filled with tears, which spilled over and traced shimmering paths down his pale cheeks. He held the book out as if it were a shield or a peace offering. "I'm Alara," he whispered, the name a confession, a verdict, a lie that had just become a catastrophic truth. And in that single, impossible moment, Liam felt the entire architecture of his heart collapse into ruin. To understand how a man like Liam could arrive at such a precipice, you have to understand the world he had built for himself long before Alara ever entered it. Liam was an architect, and his life, much like his work, was a study in precision, order, and controlled environments. His apartment was a minimalist sanctuary of clean lines, muted colors, and carefully curated objects. Everything had its place. There was a profound comfort for him in structure, in the predictable physics of stress and load, in the immutable truth of a 90-degree angle. He designed buildings meant to withstand the chaos of the outside world, to provide shelter and stability. It was a philosophy he applied to his own existence. His days were regimented. A 5-mile run at dawn, a precisely brewed cup of black coffee, long hours spent hunched over blueprints, and evenings dedicated to quiet pursuits like reading classical literature or listening to complex jazz compositions. He sought meaning in patterns, in the elegant logic of a well-designed system. Yet, this carefully constructed life was a fortress built around a hollow core. For all his mastery over physical space, his emotional landscape was a barren, unmapped territory. He was profoundly lonely. His previous relationship, a messy and painful affair with a fellow architect named Sarah, had ended 3 years prior, leaving behind a wreckage of broken trust and emotional scar tissue. Sarah had been vibrant and unpredictable, a force of nature that had initially thrilled him before ultimately overwhelming his need for control. She had called him emotionally distant, rigid, a man who loved blueprints more than people. The accusation had stung because, in his most honest moments, he feared it was true. The breakup had reinforced his worst instincts, causing him to retreat further into the safety of his structured solitude. He'd tried dating in the years that followed, but the experiences were uniformly disappointing. The small talk in loud bars felt like a performance he didn't have the script for. The endless swiping on dating apps felt like a sterile marketplace of curated images and manufactured personalities. He craved depth, a connection that bypassed the superficial rituals of modern courtship. He wanted to talk about the Stoic philosophers, the use of light in Gothic cathedrals, the quiet despair of a Chekhov play. Instead, he found conversations that rarely skimmed beneath the surface, leaving him feeling more isolated than before. His sister, Chloe, was his primary link to a messier, more compassionate world. A warm and perceptive therapist, she saw the fortress he'd built and worried about the prisoner inside. "You can't engineer a human connection, Liam," she would tell him gently over their weekly dinners. "You have to let someone see the messy drafts, not just the finished building." He would nod, understanding the wisdom in her words, but terrified of the vulnerability they required. Allowing someone in meant giving them the power to cause the same structural damage Sarah had. It was a risk his internal calculus deemed unacceptable. So he remained alone, his meticulously ordered world a quiet testament to his fear. It was in this state of quiet desperation that he discovered a small, niche online forum dedicated to literature and philosophy. It was a space of pure intellect, an anonymous haven where ideas were the only currency. And it was there, in a thread discussing the transcendentalist poets, that he first encountered a user named Alara. Their first interaction was an intellectual spark in the digital darkness. Liam had posted a lengthy analysis of Whitman's use of the body as a metaphor for the democratic soul, a piece of writing he had labored over, pouring into it the passion he rarely expressed elsewhere. Most responses were brief and complimentary, but one stood out. It was from Alara. Her comment was not just praise. It was an expansion, a thoughtful counterpoint that built upon his ideas with an elegance and insight that took his breath away. She wrote about the poem's inherent loneliness, the paradox of a poet celebrating a teeming, connected humanity while simultaneously asserting a radical, almost isolated individuality. "It's as if he's shouting his love for the crowd from a very lonely room," she wrote. Liam felt a jolt of recognition. She had seen the very thing he felt but had failed to articulate. She had seen him. He sent her a private message, a simple line of thanks for her comment. Her reply came within the hour, and soon, A conversation began to unfold, slowly at first, then with an accelerating momentum that felt like a force of nature. They moved from the forum to a private messaging app, their exchanges growing longer, more frequent, more personal. The anonymity of the screen, which had once felt like a barrier, now became a liberating sanctuary. Stripped of the anxieties of physical presence, of body language, of facial expressions, of the fear of saying the wrong thing, Liam found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years. He told her about his passion for architecture, not just the technical aspects, but the spiritual ones. How a well-placed window could feel like an act of grace, how the flow of a room could shape the lives of the people within it. She understood. She was a writer, she told him, a freelance editor who spent her days immersed in the architecture of language. She spoke of sentences as if they were structures, with load-bearing clauses and decorative flourishes. Their minds seemed to operate on a shared frequency, finding the same patterns, the same beauty in the world. Their conversations would stretch late into the night, the glow of his phone a solitary beacon in his dark, silent apartment. They talked about everything and nothing. They debated the merits of free will versus determinism, confessed their most irrational fears, and shared memories from their childhoods. Liam told her about his father's old workshop, the smell of sawdust and varnish that still represented safety and creation to him. Alara, in turn, described a lonely childhood spent in libraries, finding solace and companionship in the pages of books. She painted a picture of herself as a quiet observer, someone more comfortable with the inner world than the outer one. It was a sentiment that resonated with the deepest parts of Liam. She became the first person he spoke to in the morning and the last person he spoke to at night. Her good morning texts were the gentle sunrise to his rigidly structured days. Her good-night messages were the soft landing after hours of solitary work. He began to see her everywhere, in the turn of a phrase in a book, in the melancholy melody of a jazz standard, in the resilient beauty of a wildflower growing through a crack in the pavement. He was falling in love, not with a face or a body, but with a mind, a consciousness. It felt purer, more real than any connection he had ever known. When he finally asked for a photo, he was almost afraid it would break the spell. But the images she sent only deepened the enchantment. A woman with dark, thoughtful eyes, reading in a sunlit cafe. Another of her laughing, head thrown back, on a windswept beach. She was beautiful, but it was a quiet, approachable beauty that seemed to match the soul he had come to know. He placed her photo on his desk, a tangible anchor for the ethereal connection that was now the center of his universe. The fortress he had built around his heart didn't just have a breach. He had thrown the gates wide open and invited her in. For the first time in years, Liam felt not just safe, but seen. And he had no idea that the person who saw him so clearly was living in a shadow of her own. The connection deepened, evolving from intellectual kinship into a profound emotional intimacy. Liam found himself sharing parts of his life he kept hidden even from his sister. He confessed his anxieties about his career, his fear that his best work was behind him, that he was becoming irrelevant in a world that prized novelty over substance. Alara listened, not with platitudes, but with a deep, resonant empathy. She didn't offer easy solutions. Instead, she shared her own creative struggles, her battles with the blank page, the crippling self-doubt that every artist faces. "The silence is where the work begins," she wrote to him one night, after he described the paralyzing fear of starting a new project. "Don't be afraid of the empty space, Liam. It's not an absence. It's a possibility." Her words became his mantra. He printed them out and taped them to his monitor, a small piece of her wisdom guiding him through his day. He was becoming a better architect, a more daring one, because of her. She was his muse, his confidant, his unseen partner in all things. Their communication took on a rhythm, a ritual. They sent each other photos of their days, a cup of tea on her cluttered desk, the view of the city from his office window, a particularly beautiful passage in a book. It was a mosaic of a shared life, lived separately but in constant dialogue. Liam began to notice small inconsistencies, tiny fissures in the otherwise perfect facade of their relationship, but his desire for it to be real was a powerful lens, capable of blurring any imperfections. He suggested a video call once early on. "I'd love to see the face that goes with these brilliant words," he typed, his heart thumping with nervous excitement. The reply was delayed. When it came, it was apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she wrote, "but I'm painfully camera shy, and my laptop is ancient, the camera is broken anyway. Can we just be voices for a little while longer? I love the world we've built this way." He was disappointed, but he accepted it. Her shyness felt authentic, a part of the sensitive, introverted persona he had fallen for. It even felt romantic, an old-fashioned courtship of words and thoughts, unencumbered by the modern obsession with a visual presence. He didn't push. The idea of meeting in person began to occupy more and more of his thoughts. The digital relationship, once a sanctuary, now felt like a beautiful, gilded cage. He needed more. He needed to see her smile in real time, to hear her laugh without the filter of a phone, to hold her hand. He started to talk about the future, not in vague hypotheticals, but in concrete terms. He described the apartment he would design for them, with a sun-drenched writing studio for her and a library filled with their combined collection of books. He talked about traveling together, showing her the cathedrals of Europe he had studied but never visited. He was building their future in his mind, blueprint by blueprint. With each new plan he shared, Alara's responses grew subtly more evasive. When he suggested a weekend trip, she had a work deadline that was impossible to move. When he offered to drive to her city, a close relative was suddenly, vaguely ill. There was always a reason, always a plausible yet frustrating obstacle. Liam's friend, Mark, a brutally pragmatic software engineer, was skeptical. 6 months and not even a FaceTime, man? He'd said over a beer one night. That's not shy, that's a red flag the size of Texas. You sure she is who she says she is? Liam had become defensive. You don't understand what we have, he'd retorted. It's not about that. It's deeper, but a seed of doubt, small and cold, had been planted. He ignored it, choosing instead to double down on his faith in her. To doubt Alara felt like a betrayal of the most important connection he had ever made. He needed to believe in her. He needed to believe that the world he felt expanding within him was real. Believing was the only thing holding the loneliness at bay. On the other side of the screen, in a cramped apartment in a city 300 miles away, Leo was living in a state of escalating panic. The persona of Alara, which had begun as a shield, an experiment in connection, had become a prison of his own making. Leo was not a malicious person. He was a quiet, deeply insecure young man who had spent most of his life feeling invisible. He worked a dead-end data entry job, a monotonous existence that stood in stark contrast to the rich inner world he cultivated through books and writing. He had created the Alara profile on the literary forum years ago, borrowing photos from the forgotten social media page of a distant acquaintance. It was an avatar, a mask that allowed him to express the more thoughtful, articulate, and confident parts of himself without the paralyzing fear of judgment he felt in his own skin. As a man, he felt clumsy, unheard, and perpetually overlooked. As Alara, he was eloquent, perceptive, and magnetic. When he started talking to Liam, he had no intention of it becoming what it did. He was simply drawn to the intelligence and vulnerability in Liam's posts. He saw a kindred spirit, another lonely soul who used structure and intellect to navigate the world. Their connection felt real because, for Leo, the emotions behind Alara's words were entirely his own. He was the one staying up all night, pouring his heart out. He was the one who understood Liam's fears about his work. He was the one falling in love. But every loving message he received from Liam was a double-edged sword. It was a validation of the person he wished he could be, and a simultaneous, brutal reminder of the lie he was living. The joy of their connection was inextricably tangled with the corrosive guilt of his deception. Liam's talk of the future, of a shared life, was like a physical weight pressing down on him. He would read Liam's beautiful, hopeful messages about designing their home, and a wave of self-loathing would wash over him. He was a fraud, a thief stealing the affection meant for a woman who didn't exist. He had created a ghost and allowed a good man to fall in love with her. The excuses he gave Liam for not meeting were born of sheer terror. Each lie he told to postpone the inevitable only dug the hole deeper, making the truth more and more impossible to confess. He considered simply disappearing, deleting the account and vanishing from Liam's life without a word. But the thought was unbearable. It felt like a form of self-annihilation, erasing the only relationship in which he had ever felt truly seen and understood. And he couldn't do that to Liam. As much as he dreaded the consequences, he knew that a sudden, unexplained disappearance would be a uniquely cruel kind of torment. Liam deserved an explanation, however devastating it might be. The lie had taken on a life of its own, a monstrous thing that was now consuming him. He was trapped between two impossible choices: perpetuate a fantasy that was becoming increasingly fragile, or confess the truth and destroy the most beautiful thing he had ever known, and in the process, shatter a man he had come to genuinely care for. The stress was relentless. He wasn't sleeping. He could barely eat. He felt like a character in one of the tragic novels he loved, marching inexorably toward a catastrophic final act of his own creation. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Liam had just won a prestigious design award, a career-defining achievement. He was ecstatic, and the first person he wanted to share it with was Alara. He called her. Their communication was almost exclusively text, but in moments of high emotion, he would call, content to hear the silence on her end, knowing she was there, reading his words as he spoke them aloud. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You pushed me to be bolder, to trust my instincts. This is our win, Alara." Ours. He paused, taking a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore. Not like this. I need to see you. I need to celebrate this with you for real. I'm buying a train ticket to your city for this weekend. No more excuses. Please. I need this to be real." His words were not an attack, but a plea, a raw, vulnerable appeal that left no room for evasion. On the other end of the line, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, Leo felt the floor drop out from beneath him. This was it, the final curtain. There were no more plausible relatives to fall ill, no more imaginary work deadlines to invoke. The hopeful, loving ultimatum in Liam's voice had cornered him completely. He typed his reply with trembling fingers, the screen a blur through his tears. "Okay," he wrote. "Okay, Liam." This weekend he knew what he had to do. He couldn't confess over a text message. That would be the ultimate cowardice. He owed Liam the dignity of the truth, delivered face to face. He had to let Liam see the pathetic, real person who had caused him so much joy and was about to cause him so much pain. He agreed to meet at the central station. He told Liam he would be holding a copy of Leaves of Grass. It was a fitting symbol. The book that had started their journey would now be the marker at its devastating end. The days leading up to the meeting were a study in contrasts, a perfect, terrible illustration of dramatic irony. For Liam, they were filled with a giddy, nervous energy. He was finally going to meet the love of his life. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant. The gray cityscape outside his window looked like a masterpiece of light and shadow. The taste of his morning coffee was richer. The jazz on his stereo sounded sweeter. He bought a new coat, got a haircut, and spent hours imagining their first moment. He pictured her stepping off the train, her eyes scanning the crowd, the slow smile of recognition spreading across her face as she saw him. He imagined the feeling of her hand in his, the sound of her voice when she said his name for the first time. It was the culmination of every hope he had nurtured for the past 6 months. He confided in his sister, Chloe, his voice buzzing with excitement. "I'm terrified and I've never been happier," he admitted. Chloe, ever the cautious optimist, smiled warmly. "Just remember to be present, Liam. Let her be a real person, not just the idea you've built in your head." He promised he would. But in his heart, the idea and the person were one and the same. Alara was perfect. Their meeting would be perfect. He packed his overnight bag with meticulous care, placing the copy of Whitman on top like a sacred text. The journey to her city was a dream, the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks a soundtrack to his soaring hopes. For Leo, those same days were a descent into a private hell. With each passing hour, the dread grew, a cold, heavy presence in his chest. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a chaotic reel of Liam's face twisting from love to revulsion. He barely ate, his stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He practiced what he would say, rehearsing 1,000 different apologies in front of his bathroom mirror, but the words all sounded hollow, pathetic justifications for an unforgivable act. How do you explain that you broke someone's heart not out of malice, but out of a desperate, selfish need to feel loved? He looked at his own reflection and saw a stranger. He saw a liar, a coward. He pulled the photos of the real woman from the internet, the face he had stolen, and stared at them until his eyes burned. He was mourning Alara as much as Liam was about to. She was the best part of him, a beautiful fiction he had to kill in order to face reality. The thought of the confrontation at the train station was physically sickening. He imagined the moment of recognition, the confusion in Liam's eyes giving way to horror and disgust. He pictured the inevitable, righteous anger, the accusations, the public humiliation. Part of him wanted to run, to get on a bus and go anywhere else. But his strange, twisted love for Liam held him in place. He had to see it through. He had to take his punishment. On the day of the meeting, he dressed with the grim solemnity of a man walking to his own execution. He chose the faded jeans and the oversized sweater, clothes that offered a sense of anonymity, of disappearance. He picked up his own worn copy of Leaves of Grass, the book that had been his only true companion for years. Its weight in his hands felt like a judgment. The journey to the station was a blur. The city streets, the faces of strangers, they all seemed distant, unreal. The only thing that felt real was the leaden certainty in his gut. He was a ghost about to make himself known, and he knew with chilling clarity that the haunting was about to begin. The great clock in the center of the terminal read 3:15 p.m. Leo arrived early, his heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He found a spot against a marble pillar, a place where he could see the arrival's gate without being immediately in the flow of traffic. He clutched the book to his chest, a pathetic shield against the impending impact. Every new face that emerged from the corridor sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt dizzy, nauseous. Then he saw him, Liam. He was even more handsome than his pictures, with a kind, intelligent face that was currently alight with an open, vulnerable hope. He was standing tall, scanning the crowd with an eager intensity. Seeing that look, that pure, unadulterated anticipation was like a physical blow. Leo felt a fresh wave of self-hatred wash over him. He was about to destroy that. He was about to extinguish that light. For a moment, he was paralyzed by the urge to turn and flee. He could just melt back into the crowd, disappear, and leave Liam to wait for a woman who would never arrive. It would be cruel, but it would be less cruel than the truth. But his feet remained rooted to the spot. He had to do this. He owed him the truth. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Leo pushed himself off the pillar and began to walk toward Liam. Each step felt like it was through wet concrete. The 100 feet that separated them might as well have been 1,000 miles. He could feel Liam's gaze pass over him, dismiss him, and continue its search. Of course, he was invisible, just another anonymous face in the crowd. But then Liam's eyes flickered back, drawn by the object in Leo's hands. The book. Leo saw the flicker of confusion on Liam's face, the slight furrow of his brow. He was close now, only a few yards away. He could see the fine lines around Liam's eyes, the color of his coat, the expectant energy radiating from him. Leo stopped. He couldn't get any closer. He held the book up slightly, a gesture of surrender. Liam's gaze locked onto his, and the confusion deepened. He saw Liam force a polite, questioning smile. "Are you looking for someone?" The question was so gentle, so kind, it almost broke him. Leo opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, constricted by a knot of shame and terror. He had to say the words, the code. He forced the air from his lungs. "The stars are brightest in the ink-black sea. The change in Liam's expression was instantaneous and devastating. It was not a slow dawning, but a sudden, violent shuddering. The hope, the light, the warmth. It all vanished in a blink, as if a switch had been flipped. His face became a pale, blank mask of disbelief. The smile dissolved. His eyes, which had been so full of life, became cold, hard stones. He stared at Leo, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the impossible. The silence stretched between them, a taut, vibrating wire in the cacophony of the station. It was a silence filled with the death of 1,000 conversations, 1,000,000 shared hopes. "Who are you?" Liam's voice was unrecognizable. It was a stranger's voice, hollowed out, stripped of all emotion. Leo felt the tears he had been fighting finally break free. He couldn't bear the coldness in Liam's eyes. It was worse than the anger he had expected. It was the look of a man gazing upon something utterly alien, something that did not belong in his world. "I'm Alara," he whispered, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. The words hung in the air, an absurdity, a confession of a crime so intimate and strange that there were no laws to govern it. Liam flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if the sound had physically struck him. He looked from Leo's tear-streaked face to the book in his hand, and then back again. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the structure of his reality finally gave way. He took a step back, a reflexive retreat from the source of the contamination. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a noise of pure, undiluted pain. It was the sound of a man watching his entire emotional life burn to the ground. He turned, without another word, and walked away, his movements stiff and robotic. He didn't run. He simply moved, putting distance between himself and the wreckage, his back straight, his shoulders rigid, a man trying desperately to hold himself together as he shattered from the inside out. Leo stood alone in the middle of the crowded terminal, the book still outstretched, watching him go. The tears now flowed freely, hot streams of shame and grief. He had done it. He had told the truth, and it had been every bit as catastrophic as he had feared. The train ride home was a silent, gray blur. Liam sat staring out the window, but he saw nothing of the passing landscape. His mind was a chaotic storm of images and words, replaying the last 6 months with a horrifying new clarity. Every tender message, every late-night confession, every shared dream was now tainted, twisted into a grotesque mockery of what he thought it had been. The photos of the smiling, dark-haired woman, a stranger, a lie. The gentle, feminine prose, a fabrication. The entire identity of Alara, the woman he loved, the woman he was ready to build a life with, was a fiction, a cruel, elaborate hoax. He felt a profound and nauseating sense of violation. It wasn't just that he had been lied to. It was that his own vulnerability had been weaponized against him. He had opened his heart, exposed his deepest insecurities and hopes to a person who wasn't real. The intimacy he had cherished now felt like a grotesque intrusion, a theft. Who was that person? That trembling, tearful young man at the station? The architect in him, the man who craved logic and reason, desperately tried to understand the structure of the deception, but there was no blueprint for this kind of emotional demolition. When he arrived back at his apartment, the place that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a crime scene. Every object seemed to mock him. The photo of Alara on his desk was the most galling. He snatched it up, his hands shaking with a rage that was cold and deep. He stared at the face of the woman, a complete stranger whose image had been used as a mask. He felt a pang of pity for her, another victim in this bizarre, tangled mess. Then he looked at his own reflection in the glass of the picture frame, and what he saw horrified him. A fool, a naive, desperate fool who had been so starved for connection that he had willingly ignored the warning signs. Mark's words came back to him. A red flag the size of Texas. He had been so arrogant, so certain of the depth of their connection. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a burning heat that spread from his chest to his face. He walked numbly to his computer. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he began, with a grim and methodical precision, to erase her. He deleted every email, every chat log, every saved photograph. Thousands of words, millions of pixels, the entire digital record of their relationship, wiped away with a series of clicks. It was a brutal act of amputation, an attempt to cut away the gangrenous limb of the last 6 months. But he knew it was a futile gesture. He couldn't delete the memories. He couldn't erase the phantom limb that would ache where Ilara used to be. He worked until there was no digital trace of her left, and then he sat in the dark, the silence of his apartment now a crushing, suffocating weight. He didn't call his sister. He didn't answer the concerned texts from his friend. He was alone, truly alone, adrift in the ruins of the world he thought he had been building. The grief was immense, but it was a strange, complicated grief. He was mourning a person who had never existed, grieving the loss of a future that had only ever been a fantasy. He was mourning the death of his own hope. A week passed in a haze of sleepless nights and empty days. Liam moved through his life like an automaton, going to work, speaking to colleagues, existing in the world but not participating in it. The precision and passion that had defined his work were gone, replaced by a dull, mechanical competence. He felt disconnected from everything, as if he were watching his own life through a thick pane of glass. The digital world, once his refuge, was now a source of constant anxiety. Every notification on his phone made him flinch. He deleted his profile on the literary forum, severing his last tie to the place where the lie had begun. Then, late one night, an email arrived. The sender's name was simply Leo. Liam's first instinct was to delete it unread, but a morbid curiosity, a desperate need for some kind of explanation, stayed his hand. He clicked it open. The email was long, a wall of text that seemed to pour onto the screen in a single desperate torrent. It was a confession, an apology, a plea for understanding. Leo wrote about his own life, about the crippling loneliness and social anxiety that had led him to create Ilara. He described her not as a malicious tool of deception, but as an aspirational version of himself, the person he wished he could be, the person he felt he was on the inside. "I know it doesn't excuse what I did," he wrote, "but please believe me when I say that the connection was real for me. Everything I shared with you, every feeling, every thought, that was all me. Ilara was just the mask I wore because I was too afraid to show you my real face. I was a coward. I saw how good and kind you were, and I knew you would never want someone like me. So I let you fall in love with a ghost. I never meant to hurt you. I was just so lonely, and you were the first person who ever really saw me. Or, the part of me that was Ilara." He went on to explain that he had chosen to meet in person because he couldn't bear to confess through a screen. He felt he owed Liam the truth, face to face, no matter how ugly it was. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He only asked that Liam believe that the emotions, at least, had been genuine. "I will never contact you again," the email concluded. "I just needed you to know the why. I am so sorry for the damage I've caused." Liam read the email 3 times. His anger, which had been a cold, hard shield, began to crack. In its place, something far more complicated and painful emerged. A hollow, aching pity. He saw the story not of a cruel manipulator, but of a deeply broken and pathetic individual. The deception was no less painful, the violation no less real, but the motive behind it shifted from malicious intent to desperate, misguided self-preservation. This new understanding offered no comfort. In some ways, it made it worse. It was a tragedy, not a crime. There was no villain to hate, only 2 lonely people caught in a web of lies born from fear. He thought about responding with rage, with a detailed account of the pain Leo had inflicted. But what was the point? The damage was done. Instead, he typed a short, cold reply. "Your explanation changes nothing. The feelings may have been yours, but I was in love with Ilara. She is the one you killed. Please honor your promise not to contact me again." He hit send, and with that final, definitive act, he closed the chapter. There was no catharsis, no release, only a vast, empty silence where a beautiful story used to be. The conversation was over. The ghost had been laid to rest, and Liam was left to haunt the empty rooms of his own heart. In the months that followed, Liam's life did not return to normal. The experience had fundamentally changed him, altering the very architecture of his trust in the world and in himself. The clean lines of his orderly existence had been permanently fractured. He became more withdrawn than ever before, the fortress walls around his heart rebuilt, thicker and higher this time, reinforced with cynicism and fear. His sister, Chloe, tried to reach him. Her gentle inquiries met with monosyllabic responses. She knew something was terribly wrong, but he refused to let her in. How could he explain the situation without sounding like a complete fool? How could he articulate a heartbreak for a person who was never real? The shame was a constant companion, a quiet voice in his head that whispered of his own naivety, his own desperation. He saw deception everywhere. A friendly cashier's smile seemed duplicitous. A stranger's compliment felt like a manipulation. The world, which had briefly seemed so full of possibility, now appeared to be a landscape of hidden motives and false fronts. His work, once his greatest joy, became a chore. He could still execute the technical aspects of his job flawlessly, but the creative spark, the soul he poured into his designs, was gone. His blueprints were competent but uninspired. He had lost the ability to imagine spaces for connection, for warmth, for human flourishing. All he could design now were empty, sterile structures, perfect reflections of his own inner state. He was living the very accusation Sarah had leveled at him years ago. He had become a man who loved blueprints more than people. He had retreated so far into the safety of structure that he had forgotten how to live. The turning point, when it came, was not a dramatic epiphany but a quiet moment of painful self-awareness. He was sitting in his apartment one evening, surrounded by the perfect order he had curated, and he was struck by a profound and terrifying realization. He was no different from Leo. He, too, was hiding behind a carefully constructed facade, a facade of intellectualism, of control, of emotional self-sufficiency. He had judged Leo for his cowardice, for creating a mask to face the world, but wasn't his own rigid, isolated life a mask of a different kind? He had been so afraid of being hurt, of being seen as messy or vulnerable, that he had engineered all the humanity out of his own existence. Leo's lie was born of a desperate desire for connection. Liam's truth was a fortress designed to keep it at bay. In that moment, the anger and the pity he felt for Leo were joined by a disquieting sense of recognition. It is here that the story ceases to be just about Liam and Leo and becomes a story about us. It becomes a reflection on the silent, digital spaces where so many of us now seek the connection we struggle to find in the physical world. We present curated versions of ourselves, polished and filtered, hiding the messy, insecure, and imperfect realities of our lives. We build relationships on foundations of text and images, falling in love not with a person, but with a carefully edited narrative. And we wonder why we feel so lonely, so disconnected, even when we are more connected than ever. What is the line between self-presentation and deception? How much of ourselves do we hide in order to feel seen? Leo's actions were an extreme and destructive example, a lie that caused irreparable harm. There is no excusing the pain he inflicted, but the desperation that drove him is not an alien impulse. It is a deeply human one. It is the fear of not being enough, the yearning to be loved for the idealized version of ourselves we wish we could be. His story is a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of the internet, but about the profound consequences of a lie born from a place of genuine pain and insecurity. Liam's healing was a slow, arduous process. It began not with forgiveness for Leo, but with a fragile, tentative forgiveness for himself. He started talking to Chloe again, finally confessing the whole sordid, painful story. She listened without judgment, her therapeutic training eclipsed by her simple, unconditional love as a sister. She didn't offer solutions. She simply sat with him in his pain, validating his grief, his anger, and his shame. She helped him see that his desire for a deep connection was not a weakness to be mocked, but a fundamental human need. His vulnerability had been exploited, But it was not the source of the problem. The source was the lie. With her encouragement, he started to take small, tentative steps back into the world. He began leaving his apartment for reasons other than work. He took long walks through the city, not with a destination in mind, but simply to observe, to be present in the chaotic, unpredictable flow of human life. He started visiting art galleries, losing himself in the colors and textures of paintings, a form of communication that was honest and direct, with no hidden meanings. One Saturday, he found himself walking through a park. He saw an old couple sharing a bench, a group of friends laughing over a picnic, a child chasing a kite with uninhibited joy. These were small, ordinary moments of real, unmediated connection. He sat on an empty bench and, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to retreat into his phone or his thoughts. He just watched. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face, heard the sound of the wind in the trees, and allowed himself to simply be. A man, alone on a bench, not a fortress, but a work in progress. Scarred, yes. Wary, certainly, but no longer entirely closed. The final lesson of his painful journey was not about the treachery of others, but about the courage it takes to remain open in a world that can be so wounding. It is the courage to risk connection, to embrace the messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful reality of other people. It is the understanding that a life lived behind a perfect facade, whether digital or physical, is not a life lived at all. The question, then, that we must ask ourselves is not how to avoid being deceived, but how to build a world and a self where we are brave enough to show our true faces and compassionate enough to accept the imperfect, vulnerable, and beautifully real faces of others.